to begin.
Hey, what is up, guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Social Primate Podcast. Today we have the one and only, the legendary Dr. Rick Strassman. He's a clinical psychiatrist and researcher, and for the last 30 years or so, you've been putting in the work or contributed to the renewed interest of psychedelics and their therapeutic potential in our society and ourselves. Thank you, Dr. Rick Strassman.
Well, thanks for having me on, Eddie. It's good to see you.
Likewise. I mean, with that being said, I, for the most part, have an idea of who you are. But for some of my listeners, you're more than likely a brand new face. And just them hearing the word psychedelic is already like, what? So give us a little bit of background about the work that you've done over the last 30 years or so. What has that looked like for you?
Well, as we were talking beforehand, I was born and raised in LA, the San Fernando Valley. Born in LA, but raised in the Valley, Van Nuys. And went to college, during the tumultuous years of the late '60s, early '70s, and I was kind of awkward. I was kind of an awkward kid, socially a bit, retarded. The culture in Van Nuys back then was, fairly middle class, protected, kind of in a bubble, so when I went away to college, it was kind of a shock. So the first time I got stoned was kind of like a combination of reasons. One was I just wanted to fit in, but at the same time, I was really struck, by the change in consciousness which occurred when I smoked marijuana for the first time. It was in a lot of ways a fully psychedelic experience. There were purple clouds coming out of my speakers, and I was out of body flying over, the Pomona Valley, and it was, quite startling. I had never even been drunk before I went to college. So I started off college as a chemistry major, actually, and I wanted to make, fireworks. When I was in high school in LA, I made bombs and fireworks. And I started off as a chemistry major in college, wanting to start my own, line of fireworks. Mm-hmm. And I was discouraged, obviously, and they said, "You're a smart kid, you should be a doctor instead." So I ultimately ended up doing that. But still, the drastic change in consciousness which occurred from smoking cannabis at one time, really impressed me with the power of chemistry. This was a chemical change that occurred in the brain as a result of smoking this plant material. So as I kind of made my way through college, I was exposed to both psychedelics and to meditation, which was coming in to the West Coast at the time from Japan, Tibet, Southeast Asia, and I was struck by the similarities and descriptions of effects of certain kinds of meditation with the effects that came about through taking psychedelic drugs like LSD or mushrooms. And I thought there must be some common biological mechanism that was underlying both altered states of consciousness. In other words, if you meditate or you take psychedelics, the same part of your brain might be active. To the extent that descriptions of the two sets of experiences overlapped. So that got me interested in what I suppose might be called the biology of altered states of consciousness. And I went to medical school in order to pursue that, became a psychiatrist, got extra training in doing clinical research. Then I moved out to Albuquerque in the mid-1980s. Studied the pineal gland hormone melatonin back then because the pineal gland is a mysterious organ. Melatonin, there wasn't much known about it at the time. There were some ideas it could be psychedelic, and I thought if I gave melatonin and it was psychedelic, mm-hmm. it would be nice tidy bow, as it were. Like if you meditate, if you take psychedelics, the pineal gland is activated, and there's more melatonin, and you enter into an altered state. So that didn't quite pan out. There wasn't much known about melatonin back then, but we found out it was simply sedating, which everybody knows now. But back in the mid '80s, that was a finding.
Hmm.
In the meantime, though, I learned about DMT, which is a very powerful psychedelic, and it is made in the human body as well. So then I changed gears, as it were, and started looking at DMT. And I believe that if you gave DMT to people and it resembled certain aspects of non-drug altered states, like your meditation, near death states, dreams,
Hmm.
those sorts of things, you could propose a role for naturally occurring DMT in producing those kinds of states. So I started working on the protocol, the paperwork and whatnot, in 1988. It took 2 years of banging my head against the government, your bureaucracy, to get funding, permission,
Yeah.
grants, all those kinds of things. Yeah, so we ran that study from 1990 to 1995. It was the first new human research with these compounds in the U.S. in a generation. So
Yeah.
it jump started all of the rest of the interest that's been occurring since then.
And I mean, for a little bit of background on that, from the 70s and forward, I mean, that's when they started putting the specific drugs or these psychedelic substances on schedules, right? Schedule 1, Schedule 2, Schedule 3. And then that just made it harder for this research to be completed, correct?
Yeah, well, back in the day, well, they discovered LSD in the mid to late 40s, and it was in a lot of ways the beginning of the golden age of psychiatry. So LSD was incredibly potent, and it was chemically related, to serotonin. Serotonin was the first neurotransmitter discovered in the brain. So the LSD, serotonin connection, really started the interest in prescribing medications, to alter your mental state, be it schizophrenia, Thorazine, for example, or psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin, uh, to produce altered states of consciousness. So without LSD, there would be no Prozac, there would be no antipsychotics, there would be no anti-anxiety drugs. And in the 50s, in the 60s, there was a huge amount of research, huge, like hundreds of books and thousands of conferences and scientific papers. But then these drugs escaped the lab, so to speak. Tim Leary started proselytizing for overthrowing the government under the influence of LSD. The Vietnam War was wreaking havoc across the country. Student protests, youth protests. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago was a bloody mess, and everybody was looking. Plus lots of people who should not have been taking psychedelics were taking psychedelics. Unstable people, in combination with other drugs, alcohol, and there were quite a few psychiatric visits or psychiatric emergency room visits, psychiatric hospitalizations, suicides, accidents. It was just mayhem, and so the government had to step in
Hmm.
at the very least, because of public health concerns. So they passed the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which, as you mentioned, placed psychedelics in the most restrictive legal category, Schedule 1. And that pretty much dried things up.
Hmm.
No more funding. People had to return their drugs. The regulatory, legal, administrative requirements for doing these kinds of studies in humans just became impossible. And that's the situation that I faced when I started working on the DMT project.
Yeah, and which makes it much more important the work that you did throughout the early 90s for that same reason, And looking back now at 2023, almost 33 years ago since you first started, or 33 years ago about since you started, the conversation about around psychedelics has changed drastically. Like now you have states pushing for psilocybin studies or research. You see the legalization of marijuana across the country, like all these little things. I mean, these are not as, I mean, psilocybins could be, but, marijuana is a little bit more mild than anything, but it's still a push towards the conversation of taking accountability for yourself in terms of like what you want to put into your body in a sense, and the information that we can gather.
Right. Well, I think accompanying the increased access, there needs to be increased education.
Yes.
So we ought to understand what these drugs do, what they don't do, what they can't do. The positive effects are, coming in, but I think we also need to pay attention to possible adverse effects, and what to do if you run into trouble on a psychedelic drug experience. I think increased accessibility could be good, but it also could be trouble if it's just kind of a free-for-all. People are just taking whatever. For example, that airline pilot who jumped onto the Alaska Air plane and wanted to crash it so he would come down from a bad trip that was continuing after taking psilocybin, which he took because of his depression. There's all this hype about depressed, take psychedelics, you'll be less depressed. It's not that simple. And this guy was unstable, took psychedelics, couldn't sleep for a couple of days, was completely torqued, and almost killed 83 people. So I think we need to pay attention, to both the good and the bad, which can come.
Right. And you know what? I think you did a really great job in making it compact in terms of the information that you were able to provide for people through your one of your latest releases, the Psychedelic Handbook, which gave basically a breakdown of the way to use these things, like the pros and cons, type of like a breakdown that you normally don't see. Again, because this is for a lot of people, especially like I mentioned to you before the podcast, at least people from my culture, like you say psychedelics and they think you're talking about possessions and like these, you're hearing voices, and it's like, no, not necessarily. There's just been a disconnect between what happens and the information that's been given to us. And I don't think we've gotten to that point yet, at least for the most part with us.
Yeah, I think quite a few gaps exist when it comes to talking or thinking about psychedelics. Like on one hand, they're feared, like you'll go crazy, you'll jump off you'll jump out of a hotel room, which actually happened, to one of my high school friends.
Oh, no.
One of my track buddies. I'm after graduating from Grant High School. He went off someplace, was at a party in Las Vegas, took acid, jumped out a window because he figured he could fly.
Wow.
Yeah, and that ended fairly poorly. So on one hand, there's like the fear, which I think is overblown.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, because if you're prepared and you're supervised, you're in a safe environment and you're followed up, the chances of adverse effects are relatively low. But still, they exist. But it's not black or white. They can be helpful in the right setting as well. Therapeutic settings. Where there's where you're carefully screened, you're carefully supervised, you're prepared, you're followed up quite carefully if you have any problems you're taken care of. So I think the potential benefits are being touted now more than anything. Like Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. Very rosy, very like these are the best things since sliced bread. And I think what has occurred is an ignoring of the potential adverse effects and an overblowing of the hype of potential benefits. So one of the reasons that I wrote the Psychedelic Handbook was to present a more balanced perspective. In other words, they seem helpful in small studies, and they can be harmful, and let's talk about the harm as much as we talk about the potential benefits. So it's kind of a sober approach, which I wrote as much to balance out, both the hype and the, fear about psychedelics. You were talking about your, social,
Hmm.
culture approach, to psychedelics. There's, like a huge amount of indigenous, historical use of psychedelic, plants in Latin America. There's ayahuasca, which is a combination of DMT and another plant, which allows the DMT to be orally active.
Hmm.
There's mescaline in peyote from northern Mexico. There's mushrooms from Mexico, from the Yucatan. Um, there's snuffs from the Amazon, psychedelic snuffs. So there's a very long and illustrious history going back millennia
Hmm.
in Latin America, for the reasonable therapeutic religious use of these compounds if they're uh, approached in a careful, respectful manner.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen the information on that. I mean, just me living in a modern version of what we do now, right? And my parents are from Mexico. Like, just seeing them and other people around me, like, for sure, the conversation has moved away from using these ancient, let's just say rituals or procedures. The narrative has changed. So like even now, even if people find out you're smoking marijuana, like, sure, I mean, it gets its bad rap. I'm not gonna lie about that. But for the people who are using it for, in a sense to, I don't know, tap into their creative side or just be more connected to whatever is around them, without having to dive fully deep into a whole psilocybin trip, it's still looked upon like very negatively, and even then, like when you start talking about mushrooms, like, oh, you're gonna go crazy, dude, you're gonna go
Mm-hmm.
crazy,
Right.
of course, but it's just if the lack of information that we've known. And at the same time, I've also heard people who are like, dude, you should do shrooms, like it's gonna change your life. And it's like, it's not for everybody though, you got to understand that different people are going through different things as well.
Yeah, that's true. And I think, there is a, tendency to kind of go black or white. Like,
Hmm.
yeah, you take mushrooms, you'll have a mystical experience. You'll see God, you'll be God, and then everything falls into place.
Yeah.
Or else you're going to go completely crazy, end up in a loony bin for the rest of your life. Yeah, so, there's a lot of shades of gray when it comes to psychedelics. The most important thing, though, there's this concept of set and setting. The set is who you are, what you bring to the experience, your expectations, your health, physical and mental, your previous experiences, your education, your religious background and practice. The setting is who and where you're tripping. Is
Hmm.
it by yourself or with others? Is it outdoors or indoors? Is it for therapeutic or spiritual or just pleasurable intentions? And the drug, obviously, and the dose. You don't want to overdo it, the first time for sure.
Yeah.
And you want to be around people you trust and that care about you, that you care about, that can be there if you develop any problems. So it's a very multi
Hmm.
factorial field.
Yeah, even I think you meant what you mentioned right now, set and setting, but I think within set, it's like the intention, right? Like you must, the way that you're intending to go into this too, like, just speaking from my own experiences, I like to say that I like to go in there or, in these specific states for self growth, for just self reflection. And, again, depending on the type of person that you are, you're going to be able to take these experiences and kind of help it adapt to yourself to grow, or just kind of like, I don't know. I'm only talking from my own experience, so I can just speak for that. But it's definitely an experience that, you know I can't even put words on it.
Yeah, it's important to clarify your intention, because if you just let's say for example you're at a party and you're drunk and you're breaking up with your girlfriend, and it's really noisy and the cops are on their way, and some guy hands you some mushrooms and say, hey man, take these. It's going to be bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, as opposed to somebody who's like, I don't know, working on their career, and they have some decisions to make, and they've spoken to their family and their mentors and their friends, and they think they've got a pretty good sense of what they want to do, but they're not quite certain.
Hmm.
And they decide to take some mushrooms or some LSD or some DMT in order to get some clarity um, uh, uh, regarding what the next step in their career or their personal life is going to be.
Right.
And they set things up like weeks in advance, where they're going to
Hmm.
do it and with who, and who to call, and like, are they going to play music or not? Will they take notes or not? Will they have friends there, or are friends available to call? So at one end of the pole would be completely impulsive use, and the effects will probably not turn out that well,
Right.
or very preconceived thoughtful approach, and the outcome will most likely be a lot better.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we've especially you, I'm sure you've seen your experiences of or all the sides of that spectrum, like in terms of how people react to these things. And just going back a little bit into that, I mean, the book that you wrote, I think is 2000, the DMT, the spirit molecule. I mean, that's where you basically documented your findings and research from the early 90s, right?
Right. That book came out, I think, December 2000. Yeah, it's like 23, almost 24 years old
20.
now. Yeah, well, it was a great story. The whole
Hmm.
DMT project at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque was a great story. There was the government, there was the DEA, there was the FDA, there were all kinds of bureaucratic hoops to jump through. The experiences of the volunteers were absolutely incredible. And I ended the research for a number of reasons, which I also detail. And then I kind of speculate about what it all meant or means.
Hmm.
Yeah, so that book has done great.
Yeah, of course.
like, I love that book, and that book loves me. It continues selling more every year over the last 20 years, if you can
Oh my
believe
God,
that.
that's so crazy. I
Yeah,
mean,
yes. So it's influenced a
mhm.
generation of researchers, students, psychedelic enthusiasts. It's yeah. I knew that what I was doing was so far out, that I had to document it,
Yeah.
and I did.
And you did a fantastic job. You know, I feel like it covered stuff up because sometimes you read things and you kind of feel like you walked out of there with only one side of it, but you know, you try to balance it out really well. And I think that's what you've done pretty good with a lot of the books that you've written as well. You know, that you try to, as much as possible, try to give an unbiased view of what this experience is. You know, so this experience that not a lot of us have the opportunity to see, you know, or to view. But since then, so now you've done 30 years, you've seen the impact, or 23 years, you've seen the impact of this book. As of now, like, how do you feel about this work that you've done, and where do you see yourself moving forward? I know you have a new book it's being published, it's going to be releasing like maybe what, next year or so?
In the next year, yeah,
Okay.
hopefully next summer or the fall. Yeah. Well, with respect to my approach to this work all along, and in the spirit molecule itself, in the conclusion, like, I had not written the conclusion until the very end of writing the book, and I didn't know which side of the fence I was going to land. Was I going to say it was a good idea or is
Hmm.
a bad idea? Like, I help people or I hurt people? Like, I just couldn't quite decide. So um, my approach has always been to educate as opposed to
Hmm.
proselytize or advocate. Or if I do advocate, it's learn what you can about these substances and their effects, as opposed to advocating that everybody should get high.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I also wondered toward the end of the spirit molecule if our work had opened Pandora's box. That the genie was out of the bottle, and let's see what happens. And it may be for good, it may be for ill. So our studies were pretty much under the radar for a long time. I helped a couple of other groups get started with their projects. an MDMA study at UCLA, on a psilocybin study for obsessive compulsive disorder in the University of Arizona. Um, and ibogaine study, that's an African plant for addiction, in Miami. But it wasn't until I, provided the secret sauce to the group at Hopkins in the mid to late, 1990s after our work was done.
Hmm.
I also, ran some psilocybin, work at UNM. So the Hopkins, group was interested in doing a psilocybin study, and I, gave them all my information regarding
Hmm.
psilocybin. So they, ran with the ball and published that mystical experience study in 2006, which really got the ball rolling. Like it was on national TV and all that. So but to be honest, I was hoping that the Hopkins group would have taken a more level-headed approach to studying psilocybin. The main investigator there was a pharmacologist named Roland Griffiths, with a long and illustrious history in studying drugs of abuse. Very
Hmm.
level-headed. You give this drug, and certain things happen psychologically, biologically. And I hope that the Hopkins group would have applied that same model to psilocybin. But instead it was this mystical experience, mumbo jumbo. And I
Hmm.
just kind of smacked my forehead when that paper came out saying, this is not what I wanted them to do. This is not what I wanted them to do with the information I provided them. Because it gives a false impression that you take a drug and you have a religious experience, which is kind of still the meme that's pervading the discussion, more or less, that these are wonder drugs, they're
Hmm.
spiritual drugs. And when I mentioned the Pandora's box thing, that really came to mind when that paper came out. Like, oh God, not this again. Because that was in a lot of ways what ended the research in the late '60s, is that investigators got religion. They became zealots, missionaries. And that was one of the arguments that the government brought to bear, saying even the scientists can't be trusted to study these drugs.
Hmm.
But the
Hmm.
tide has turned. There's a lot more of a liberal, progressive, kind of new age approach out there, even within academics. So that kind of missionary zeal, wasn't prevented from emerging from those studies, which have influenced all the rest of the work that's been going on since then. So that's one thing. The academics have kind of in a way gone off the deep end, which I'm happy to see. The commercialization is a new thing. There's all these millions of psychedelic startups, and I was super busy maybe 4 or 5 years ago.
Hmm.
Pollan's book came out. Everybody wanted to start a psychedelic drug company, and those are mostly falling by the wayside now. But still, there are some big players remaining. So there's a lot of hype. Like you can make a lot of money studying psychedelics and giving them in commercial clinics and
Yeah.
things. Even so, like I'm invested in ATAI, which is one of the biggest players in the psychedelic commercialization movement. And I don't know when I invested 3, 4, 5 years ago, and it's down 95% from the price I paid for it.
Yeah.
So even though there's all this hype, like psychedelics are going to revolutionize mental health care around the world, it's not quite happening yet.
Not yet. Yeah, sure. It's been a couple of decades already, but I mean, it only looks like that, like you just mentioned, like the progression is kind of building the momentum slowly, like I've heard this argument with a lot of different people that I've come across that are psychonauts and all this stuff, but they're saying like everybody in the world should do psychedelics. It'll change. It'll make us better. But again, that's a conversation that's full of imagination because anything can happen when that happens.
Well, yeah, I mean, the case in point I like to bring up to everybody's kind of moans and groans is, Charles Manson and, his use of
Uh-huh.
LSD and his, followers. You can use these, drugs for good or for bad.
Yeah.
So all because you take a drug doesn't mean it's going to promote, world peace. There was
Mm-hmm.
a few years after, the Manson, caper, there was a, doomsday, cult in Japan, that, poisoned, the subway with, sarin gas.
Oh, yes.
And that cult used a ton of LSD to indoctrinate, to convince people of the truth of their crazy ideas, save the world by killing it. So
Mm-hmm.
you can come up with all kinds of results. But it returns to the notion of set and setting and intent. Why are you tripping, and with who, and what is your mental state as you're going in there?
Mm-hmm.
Um, a couple of years ago, there was a study, giving ayahuasca, which is that DMT
Yep.
uh, brew, to Palestinians and Israelis, in the with the goal in mind of increasing compassion and empathy and understanding with each other. And lo and behold, they were more compassionate, more empathic, and more understanding of each other. But I'll tell you, you couldn't have gotten those people in the same room unless they already had an inkling that there was something to be had by
Mm.
increasing empathy, compassion, and understanding in the first place. If there were a number of years back, people were saying, "Oh, if only Trump took MDMA or LSD," and I would say I would not want to be around
Uh-huh.
Trump on LSD, because he would beat Trump on LSD. So
Yeah.
yeah, you just can't be
Right.
kind of woolly brained about the whole thing.
And this is exactly why it fascinates me, because you don't know what you're getting. Just like that's how the experience is. And like the whole reefer madness stuff, like it seemed like there was propaganda to, or like the war on drugs, like to kind of push people away from getting involved with all this type of stuff. Now, there's another thing that says that because these drugs have the ability to kind of bring you to another state of consciousness, it's something that supposedly, right, the government doesn't want because it melts the fabrics of society.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's what a lot of people, say is, the government clamped down on these drugs because of, um, they didn't want us to glimpse another version of reality that, they were guarding.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but I think that's completely bogus. I think that's
Yeah.
completely untrue. Uh, it was, the ideas and the behavior that was alarming, the regulators and, the legislators. Rioting is not cool. Burning down buildings isn't cool.
Yeah.
Dropping out and just, living in the middle of, nowhere and wasting away your life, that's not cool. So, uh, psychedelics are, called psychedelic for a reason. Um, some of the other terms used for these drugs is like hallucinogen, which is inaccurate, because you don't hallucinate. And what is a hallucination in the first place? It kind of paints the experience as imaginary or
Mm-hmm.
false or pathological. They also used to be called psychotomimetics. They mimicked psychosis, and
Psychosis.
that's a kind of a negative term. But on the other side of the spectrum is calling these compounds entheogens. They generate the divine within, which is also kind of ridiculous, because what if you don't believe in the divine, or if you do believe in the divine,
Mm-hmm.
you don't believe it can be caused by taking a drug, or that it exists within you as opposed to externally. So psychedelic actually just means mind manifesting or mind disclosing. They kind of non-specifically amplify or magnify what's already in your mind, more or
Mm-hmm.
less conscious. So if you're a good person and want to be better, it'll it'll work on those mental contents. If you're an angry person and you want to get revenge on society,
It's
and you
yeah,
take
you're gonna
the drug, for that reason, those experiences, those ideas will come up. So they're psychedelic. They work on who you are, their
mhm.
mind manifesting.
What's your outlook on microdosing? Because I know that's something that's kind of picked up traction as well over the last couple of years. People don't want to go take a full dose of DMT or ayahuasca or psilocybin. They just want to take it in small doses where they can feel a slight change, but they can kind of still continue with their daily routine.
Mhm. Well, it depends on what you call a microdose,
Hmm.
and I like to divide microdoses into three categories. There's like mini microdoses where you don't feel anything at all, like zero,
Hmm.
and they that could be helpful in a manner similar to antidepressants.
Okay.
There isn't much of an acute effect, psychologically or subjectively. There's not any experience per se, but the receptor changes in the brain receptor, neurotransmitter, synapses, those kinds of things. The brain physiology, if you take a small dose of a psychedelic, like that, is similar, to antidepressants, like the SSRIs, and like Prozac. So theoretically, if you take a microdose of LSD, let's say every day for a few weeks, and it's a microdose, you don't feel anything at all. Your mood could improve if you're already
Hmm.
depressed, or your anxiety could improve if you're anxious. The next step up would be like a moderate microdose where you feel an acute effect, like you take the dose and you feel slightly stimulated, and you're
Hmm.
thinking a little more quickly, a bit more creatively, um, and you probably wouldn't. Well, depending on how you took that dose, it could just be like caffeine, for example, or if you were taking it every day, it would then produce the same kind of brain changes that would occur with an antidepressant as well. So there would be an acute effect, like immediately after taking it, and also a longer term one. The larger microdoses would be something which would have an acute effect, but it would be a bit more sparkly than just caffeine. You would feel like if you went up a little higher, you would get a sense of actually beginning uh, to trip.
Hmm.
There's a little bit of shine in the room. Your ideas are flowing a lot more freely than usual. Those kinds of things. Um, all that being said, there's tons of survey data on that. There, you recruit people online and you ask them to fill questionnaires out regarding their experiences of microdosing and how they do it. And there's a lot of positive effects, and there's also some negative effects. But the main thing is, what are the data, like the real scientific
Hmm.
data from the clinical research laboratory? And there's not much out there. And the studies which have occurred or taken place are just single microdoses,
Hmm.
as opposed to repeated ones. There's one study from Chicago, giving 3 small doses of LSD over the space of a couple of weeks. So there are some changes in mood and attention and brain function, electroencephalography, on all of those electrodes on your head.
Hmm.
But compared to the claims being made by proponents of microdosing, the actual effects in the laboratory are quite subtle and quite mild.
Yeah.
So there's a ton of more research that needs to take place.
Yeah, because I guess this goes for everything, but if let's say you're microdosing and you're going in there with the whole intent and all that stuff as well, it's gonna be very minimal. You're still telling yourself that you're gonna feel a specific way after you take this. So isn't that like kind of like a placebo also?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, and if you look at the studies of full doses of psychedelics, they seem to be panaceas. They do everything.
Hmm.
Everything you want them to do, they do. Like smoking, opiates, cocaine. They stop people from from abusing drugs. They make you happier, more open, more progressive, more nature appreciating. Your relationships are better. I mean, the list goes
Yeah.
on. So there is a placebo element, to the response of psychedelics, and in fact, I think it would be useful even to think about psychedelics as super placebos.
Hmm.
So once again, depending on who you are, your expectations and your hopes, those, if they're steered, if the effects of the compounds of the drugs are steered in the direction that you desire, you will get the results that you desire. So I think with small doses, micro doses, there may be a placebo response without a subjective effect. So if you take a barely noticeable dose of LSD, for example, and you are doing that because you want to be happier or more productive, or your relationship needs some work, it could be that because of their effect of being super placebos, you could have perhaps the same response with a small dose as a big dose. One interesting thing that's on the horizon is these non-psychedelic psychedelics out there.
Hmm.
They produce the same kinds of brain changes which occur with normal psychedelics, but at least in lower animals without behavioral effects. So I think they're doing some studies in humans with these compounds, but I haven't seen anything published yet. But I think what may turn out to be the case is that these non-psychoactive psychedelics are like the antidepressants.
Hmm.
They'll be super antidepressants. Helpful in most people who combine them with psychotherapy or counseling or spiritual practice, let's say, but not as helpful as a full dose. But a full dose in difficult cases or whatnot also comes with the increased risk of adverse effects.
Hmm. The non-psychedelic, or yeah, non-psychedelic psychedelics that you were referring to, are those like man-made, or are those organic, I guess?
Yeah, the other laboratory creations.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, the one which is of greatest interest at this point is a compound that was developed using ibogaine as the starting
Hmm.
material. It's called TBG. Yeah, so there's a group up at UC Davis has been looking at this for a number of years, and they have a private company in
Hmm.
Massachusetts, and I think if they aren't studying TBG yet in humans, they're about to.
Real quick, so okay, so we're talking about that's something that's made in the lab. Now, from my understanding, DMT is something that can happen naturally in your body when it's put through these moments of, I guess, pressure, or some of the examples were be like birth, near death experiences. Can you explain a little bit about how DMT is naturally created in our body?
Yeah, well, it was first discovered in human body fluids in the mid 60s. Blood, urine, and spinal fluid. The fluid that surrounds your spinal cord and your brain.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's made in the human body. Yeah, there's a study came out in 2019 from Ann Arbor, Michigan, University of Michigan, demonstrating that the rodent brain makes DMT
Hmm.
in quite high quantities, like comparable to normal neurotransmitters like serotonin. So that's extremely interesting. You kind of have to wonder, is there a DMT neurotransmitter system out there like a serotonin neurotransmitter system? And if there were, what's what's it doing in
Hmm.
in the mammalian brain. So that same study demonstrated that in the dying rodent brain, like if you give the rodent a heart attack, uh, you know,
Hmm.
kind of cruel kind of research, but still the science marches on.
Yeah.
If you kill an animal experimentally, that concentrations increase in the brain, especially in the visual cortex. So that supports the idea that increases in DMT in the brain, in specific parts of the brain, may mediate certain phenomena that people describe when they're dying. The visions or the out of body work, but especially the visions.
Hmm.
If concentrations of DMT are increasing in the visual cortex in the dying animal, that supports the idea that naturally occurring DMT is mediating those visions.
Hmm.
That's the only situation or condition that we know stimulates the release or the production of DMT in the living animal or the dying animal. So it's extremely hard to measure DMT in the intact animal.
Hmm.
There's a fellow at UC San Diego, John Dean, who's working on visualizing synthesis of DMT in the living human brain using scanning technology. So I think once we're able to visualize the production of DMT, we'll be able to then start correlating it with other naturally occurring altered states like schizophrenia, like mystical experience, like prayer,
Hmm.
anything which resembles what happens when you give DMT. That was the idea behind my original study. Like if you gave DMT and it reproduced certain elements of non-drug altered states, you could hypothesize that naturally occurring DMT is responsible, for those non-drug states. So right now there's a lot of evidence, pointing, to DMT being involved in the near-death state, and you may turn out, to also be the case in dreams,
Hmm.
meditation, psychosis, things like that.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, because I mean, I know there's certain states of meditation that can maybe give you a little taste, but you still needed some sort of chemical influence that's gonna like, you know, take you to another world, basically.
Right. Drugs are a lot more reliable.
Yeah.
But that comes with its own risk. Yeah. One of my DMT volunteers came out of the state and said, "Well, can't you reach this on can't you reach this through meditation?" And I kind of laughed and said, "Well, good luck."
You're gonna spend years probably trying to get to that state of
Right.
mind too.
Right. Yeah, but if you were spending years, trying to get that state, you would be, better equipped, to be able to understand it and integrate it and communicate it in your life. So,
Yeah. I mean, that's true. There's a lot of fear that comes into when you start thinking about going on a psychedelic thing, but like a lot of the things just having no control, right? Like everything, like it's funny. I've heard, I forgot where I heard this, but it said something. This is regards to mushrooms, but it says like sometimes a mushroom shows you what you have to see, not what you want to see. And I feel like that's the experience sometimes people get with just a variety of psychedelics. Like you're just shown, you don't have control. You have no control whatsoever of what's gonna appear or you're gonna go through, and I think that's what a lot of the times is scary because everybody's scared of the unknown.
right. Well, you need to be prepared, and you need to have a toolbox, at your disposal. For example, how do you distinguish between a friendly being in that state or an unfriendly one? How do you ask the right questions? How do you understand the answers? What do you do if you're frightened? What do you do if you start leaving your body? So you need to be prepared, educate yourself. Have a set of methods in your mind beforehand
Hmm.
to contend. Yeah, so you know, and some of these can be kind of spiritual technologies or techniques in a way. Like if you're comfortable with praying, uh, in general, church or synagogue or whatnot, and you're in a tight spot or you need some help or you want to break through some more, you can pray in that state. Or if you're a meditator or a visualizer, and you need some help or you need some direction or some, if or some more sure footing,
Hmm.
you could rely on methods that you've developed already in your life in the sober state in order to help interact with the contents of a psychedelic one.
Dr. Rick Strassman, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with me. Again, thank you for all the work you've done. I know you probably get these kind of things all the time, but like, thank you for everything you've done. And it's, important stuff that I feel like, people like myself now and people moving forward, younger than myself, they're going to be completely interested in, and just trying to, push the narrative and take control of, how we educate ourselves. What's the
Right.
best?
We need,
Oh yeah, sorry.
yeah, yeah. It's important that we enlarge the discussion as much as possible. So to the extent that my work has helped that, I'm grateful.
What is the best way for people to find your new book that's coming out next year and any of your past work?
Yeah, so people can look at my website rickstrassman.com, and my email address is on there, and I answer pretty much every email. And I have a minor Facebook presence as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.
Well, thanks, Eddie. It's a pleasure.